VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And thank you for joining us today on Crosstalk on VCY America as we turn our focus toward Israel and toward the Jewish people. Specifically, we'll be looking at COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, even though the coronavirus originated in communist China, did you know there are those who are blaming Israel for the virus? Are you aware of the anti-Semitism that's spiked since the virus came out? Are you aware that even the mayor of New York City singled out Jews for not physically distancing from one another? We invite you to stay tuned as we talk about these and other matters with our special guest today, Chris Katulka. Chris is host of the radio program, The Friends of Israel Today. He also serves as a speaker, writer, blogger for the Friends of Israel and writes for Israel My Glory magazine. The Friends of Israel is a worldwide Christian ministry communicating biblical truth about Israel and the Messiah while fostering solidarity with the Jewish people. Chris, thank you for joining us here today on Crosstalk.
Jim, great to be with you again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've had in my hand a copy of this Al Arabia News article in which, Chris, we've got the Iranian regime that's been blaming the United States and its allies, but particularly Israel, for the country's coronavirus crisis. Israel's been accused of being behind this for profit. There is one known as Abdul Malik, the leader of the Iranian-backed Houthi militias in Yemen, saying that it's possible that the Zionist lobby spread a pandemic and created a vaccine for treatment in exchange of immense profit. Your response to this?
It's just the same tropes and rhetoric, anti-Israel rhetoric that comes out of Iran. That's been going on for many, many decades now, to point the blame at Israel, to make them look bad. And there's a lot of people that will believe what's being said there from the Iranian regime, sadly, in the Middle East. But the reality is this, is that it's just them trying to point the finger. On the flip side of that in Iran, the funny thing is they said that if the Zionists, those are the Israelis, if they come up with a cure for COVID-19, for the coronavirus, then you have permission to go ahead.
Wow.
They gave them permission to take the cure, but at the same time, they're quick to point the finger and to blame Israel, which is honestly, it's gotten just so bad over there that it's just no surprise that they would do that. So when you read those things, it's a shock, but when you read it so many times, you just go, well, that sounds like Iran to me. But the idea of blaming Israel for this, blaming the Jewish people for this, it's just an ancient trope. It's an ancient anti-Semitic way of blaming the Jewish people for these pandemics, epidemics, and whatnot.
You know, it must be in that real fine 6-point type that says if Israel finds a cure for coronavirus, the BDS movement does not apply.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Well, this, while this came out of the Middle East, it's also coming out of places here in the United States, and I saw it coming out of Chicago. Jihad Watch reporting that Iman Omar Balak declared that the coronavirus may be a Zionist American plot to throttle the growth of the Chinese economy, a punishment from Allah and the work of shadowy secret societies. But at the forefront of this, a Zionist American plot that's coming out of Imam from Chicago.
Yeah, again, it's the same mentality. It's kind of built into the radical Islamic groups to blame Jewish people for the plights of the world. It's built into the way that they understand the world around them to blame Israel, to blame the Jewish people for pandemics, for epidemics, for financial crises that happen around the world. And so, again, it's no different whether it's in Chicago or whether it's in the streets of Saudi Arabia or, coming from the political halls of Iran and Tehran. It's that mentality that a lot of the of the religious, and I'm going to say very religious, jihadist Muslims definitely have a very anti-Semitic way of looking at Israel and the Jewish people. It's the hatred of the Jewish people, and it's pinning and blaming them for all the problems in the world.
But what's interesting at the same time, Chris, I mean, when you look at the Israeli hospitals and Israeli medical teams, they're the ones that are providing care and treatment for those, even from the Palestinian Authority.
That's right. Up in the borders of Syria, between Syria and Israel, there are medical tents that were supplying help for those Syrians that were finding themselves in a desperate situation. Israel was opening medical tents for them to find medical help. And, a lot of times these Syrians, these Palestinians, Egyptians, whoever it might be, they're raised to really kind of hate Israel. Israel's the problem. But as more and more Middle Easterners go to Israel for education, for higher education, for college, they come away and they go, I was taught that Israel hated us, that the Jewish people hated us, but really I felt loved and accepted by them. That whole story even goes back. You might have heard of the one beauty pageant that happened with the woman from Iraq. She took a picture with a woman from Israel, and the Iraqi people practically banished her. But she said, these people, Israel loves us. I don't understand why we hate them so much. It's embedded in the culture, and it doesn't matter where they go around the world, Jim, whether they're in the Middle East or whether they're in Chicago. It's embedded in the culture, sadly.
Chris Katolka with us here today from the Friends of Israel. Chris, many were just shocked by some tweets that were sent out last Thursday by the New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, singling out the Jewish community. I'd like to quote them and get your response. This is April 28th in the evening. He said, something absolutely unacceptable happened in Williamsburg tonight, a large funeral gathering in the middle of the pandemic. When I heard, I went there myself to ensure the crowd was dispersed, and what I saw will not be tolerated so long as we are fighting the coronavirus. My message to the Jewish community and all communities is this simple. The time for warnings has passed. I've instructed the NYPD to proceed immediately to summons or even arrest those who gather in large groups. This is about stopping the disease and saving lives. Period. Naming the Jewish community in his tweets.
It's sad because he specifically points out the Jewish community. And what this doesn't do is it doesn't paint the picture of what the Jewish community of New York is. Number one, New York is the largest Jewish community in America, and it's practically the largest Jewish community outside of Israel. So it's not a monolithic group of people that we're talking about here. The Jewish community in New York City isn't just a group of Orthodox Jewish people who don't like the rules that banish them from worshiping God. There are plenty of Jewish people in New York that are honoring the laws and the restrictions and keeping their distance and staying home and doing everything that the government tells them to do. So when Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, calls out the Jewish community for a sect, for a group of people that were doing something, that is what is called anti-Semitism. And on top of that, it's not just Jewish people that are breaking,
right.
Especially the religious Jewish community. It's not just them gathering together. The Muslims are gathering together. There are Christian groups that are gathering together. There are non-religious groups that are gathering together. So when to just lay blame to the Jewish people is a form of anti-Semitism, a hatred of the Jewish people. It calls them out, and what it only does is, I don't believe Bill de Blasio is an anti-Semite. I don't think he hates the Jewish people. But I will say this, he only is inflaming and enraging and giving voice to those who do have the anti-Semitic tendencies and to blame the Jewish people for things. And that's not right, especially when a few tweets before that one that he put out on Twitter, especially when it actually was telling the Muslim community, hey, we have special halal food for you during this time of crisis. We want to help you during this time.
Let me quote these. As a matter of fact, it was 5 days earlier. Those went out on April 28th, but on April 23rd, From the same mayor, Ramadan is a month to reflect, to build discipline, and to become closer to God. And as our city continues to confront the COVID-19 crisis, every New Yorker can learn from such a profound act of faith. Ramadan Mubarak to all of our neighbors beginning their fast. He went on to say, to the Muslim New Yorkers beginning their celebrations tonight who need halal meals, we have them across our 400-plus grab-and-go meal sites and are bringing hundreds of thousands more to the 32 sites most frequented by our Muslim communities. Go to nyc.gov, get food for more. I mean, this is just a night and day difference.
It's a night and day. You know, where's the kosher food section that the Jewish community can go to? That's not the treatment that they get. And, you know, Ramadan, I would, several years ago, I'd lead a group every year to volunteer in Israel during the Ramadan. So we'd be in Israel helping the Israeli people. But it just so happened to be that while we were over there, Ramadan was going on. And this isn't a time for people to stay at home during Ramadan. People are out and about. They're worshiping God. They're connected. People going to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. There were crowds and crowds of people, especially after the fast breaks during the day during Ramadan. The people just want to get together and eat food. I mean, groups of families would be getting together. So for Bill de Blasio to encourage, you know, that we have food, you know, people will come out in the droves for that. But then to say that Jewish people couldn't honor a funeral, and he calls out that community, and then just subtly, that's the part that's sad, is that he calls the Jewish community out in that tweet, but then he subtly goes, and all other communities. No, he should have just said, please, all communities of any religious background or non-religious background, please honor the restrictions for the safeties of others. Instead, he called out the Jewish people. Again, it only incites, I think, anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and Councilman Deutsch sent out then what? This is to be a joke to the mayor of NYC, really just single out one specific ethnic community, a community that's been the target of increasing hate crimes in his city as being non-compliant. Has he been to a park lately? What am I saying? Of course he has. Of course the mayor's been seeing many miles from his house going for a walk. But then he said, but singling out one community is ridiculous. Every neighborhood has people who are being non-compliant. To speak to an entire ethnic group as though we are all flagrantly violating precautions is offensive. It's stereotyping, and it's inviting anti-Semitism. I'm truly stunned. And that just echoes, Chris, what you were saying there.
Yeah, it only incites people. Because, listen, anti-Semitism is a real issue. And I want to, again, remind your listeners, anti-Semitism simply means the hatred of the Jewish people. It's something that's been going on for a very long time. You know, you'd think after the Holocaust, the world might have dealt with this issue of isolating and picking out and targeting Jewish people because of what happened, especially as Israel just remembered earlier, at the end of April, Holocaust remembrance, remembering those who suffered during the Holocaust, the Jewish people. You would think we would have known by now. But again, we're picking out these groups of people, the Jewish people, and it only incites those who don't like Israel, who blame the Jewish people. There's a lot of them around the world, and this only helps to inflame what they already believe. So it's a shame what Bill de Blasio said there as mayor.
I think it's also interesting. There was a Jewish community activist, Isaac Abraham, noted that there was no mayoral scolding of city residents who violated this physical distancing rules, you know, during the flyover by the Blue Angels and the Thunderbirds, saying those crowds were around a whole lot longer than the funeral. And he also said that the police helped plan the funeral, and they knew a large crowd was going to attend. So really appears to be a double standard.
You know, I think it's sad. Let me just say this. I know a lot of people who have lost loved ones, and so this is just a sad time for the Jewish community as well during a funeral. So to isolate them is wrong.
We're going to take a quick break. Folks, have handy a sheet of paper, a pen, or pencil. We'll be providing you a phone number, a website as well. You'll be receiving some information how you can receive a free subscription to the magazine called Israel, My Glory. Back in a minute. You're listening to Crosstalk.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, scientist with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, where do blind cave fish come from?
Chris, it seems that some fish get trapped in caves living in total darkness. They have no use for their eyes, thus their eyes atrophy and no longer develop. But some of these fish are virtually identical to fish that live in lakes and streams nearby which do have eyes. I've long wondered what would happen if you took some of these blind fish and raised them in a lit environment. would their eyes begin to develop? The fish still have the genes for eyes, but they're never switched on. Thus, the eyes are never expressed. I've often wondered if they're interfertile with the sighted fish. This seems to be a good research project, but as far as I know, the blind fish are protected, and no such research has been done. Chris, fish were created on day 5 of Creation Week, and that happened back in Genesis.
To learn more about creation, get our free DVD called That's a Fact. Call us at 800-628-7640 and mention the promo code FACT.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. COVID-19 in Israel, our topic today. Yeah, much anti-Semitism spiking as a result. Chris Tolka is with us today, host of the radio program, The Friends of Israel Today. Chris, for many, many, many years, Friends of Israel has been putting forth a magazine called Israel, My Glory. Just give us an overview of what this magazine is.
Yeah, Israel, My Glory has been around since 1942, and it's been our passion at the Friends of Israel to communicate biblical truth about Israel and Jesus the Messiah, and from a biblical worldview. So we look at events that are happening in a relevant way in Israel today, and we look at them and we talk about them in Israel, My Glory. But then, we also look at the biblical side of what's going on as well. We highlight, we give commentary to what the Bible says as well about Israel. So I'm very excited to offer your listeners a year-free subscription to our award-winning Christian magazine, Israel, My Glory. I think it'll be a blessing to them.
And how can our listeners obtain it?
Yeah, the number one, they can call right to our headquarters right now at the Friends of Israel by calling 1-800-257-7843. That's 1-800-257-7843. Or they can go to our website, which is foi.org, as in Friends of Israel, foi.org.
Okay, again, friends, you can just call and ask for that free year subscription to Israel, My Glory. Right now they have the East Coast hours are between 8 and 5. And if you don't get through today, you can try them tomorrow. The number is 1-800-257-7843 and ask for the magazine, a year subscription to Israel, My Glory, or go online to foi.org. That stands for Friends of Israel, foi.org. We see the coronavirus, and right away we see so many fingers pointed at Israel, whether it be from the Middle Eastern Islamic nations, whether it be from even those within the United States, the anti-Semitism that's been building through this time as well. This is not the first time in history this has happened, is it?
No, there's a long history, Jim, of blaming Jewish people for global pandemics, global epidemics, financial crises. Actually, I was reading up on this not too long ago because me and my colleague, Steve Herzig, we did a video on the history of blaming Jewish people. You can find that at our website as well. But the one that really struck me goes back more than 2,000 years, actually before even the time of Jesus. It was 2,300 years ago. There was a priest in Egypt, so an Egyptian priest, and he retold the Exodus story from a different angle. And so instead of it being that God delivered the Jewish people from the bondage of Egypt, he actually flipped it around and said the reason that the Jewish people, the Israelites, left Egypt was not because God delivered them. It was because they brought a pandemic to Egypt. They were the pandemic. They brought the plagues. They were the reason why. And so Egypt kicked them out because they were the ones blaming the Jewish people for the pandemic, their pandemic. That goes back 2,300 years ago. And then, of course, you have the Black Plague that happened in the 13th century A.D., a horrible time where many people died. Jewish people were blamed for that plague. Jewish people were blamed for the Spanish flu that happened in the early 20th century. And so, in fact, even when Hitler was rounding up the Jewish people to put them into concentration camps and into ghettos, actually, he justified the rounding up of the Jewish people to put them in ghettos because he was telling the people they might spread viruses and diseases, so we need to keep them isolated and quarantined in their own area. And so, again, that mentality of blaming Jewish people, Hitler also blamed the Jewish people for the financial crisis, even up to the 2008 crisis that happened, the recession. Jewish people were being blamed for that. If you ever go and look at any videos of protesters on Wall Street, on YouTube, just go down to the comments section. That's always where the most negative stuff comes out. You really see the heart of people, and it's not pretty. It's pretty disgusting. And when you read through those comments, people are constantly blaming Jewish people for the financial crises in the world, for the pandemics of the world. So that anti-Semitism is an age-old trope that goes back thousands and thousands of years, blaming God's chosen people.
And so we even get current then with, what were the tweets going out from the mayor and from others. But it was not long before Mayor de Blasio had issued these that the New York Times ran a story that the coronavirus has brought a spike in anti-Semitic sentiments, with hatred coming from right-wing European politicians. They say ultra-conservative American pastors. That's an interesting statement. Anti-Zionist intellectuals and Iranian state authorities. Increases in anti-Semitism are happening on an annual basis. Every year it's more than the other. Why is the increase on this? And also, do you have any clue as to what they mean by ultra-conservative American pastors?
Yeah, well, I think actually there's a point that, the whole conservative liberal, that we look at it usually as a line, over here on this side, over here on that side. Sometimes it can almost be like a circle, not like a straight line. Mm-hmm. And sadly, I think they like to shove any type of pastor into the conservative realm, and it's hard to disengage from them because of that. There was a pastor that came out of Florida that actually has a pretty decent-sized church. His last name's Hiles, and he also has a news agency as well called True News, and he actually blamed the Jewish people for coronavirus. A pastor, a so-called Christian, blamed the Jewish people for the coronavirus, and he also said that, anybody that goes into the synagogues comes out with the coronavirus. God is judging the Jewish people. God is judging other religions. And so just a real anti-Semitic Jewish hatred coming out of this so-called Christian man. This is actually one of the reasons that me and my colleagues did the video on the history of blaming Jewish people, because of what this pastor was saying. And to think that he has a large audience and that people are listening to him is not good. And this probably isn't the first time that he's blamed the Jewish people for things as well. But really, for me, Jim, the reason that we can go back thousands of years and see how people have been blaming the Jewish people for things is, I always like to say God or Satan attacks what God values. If God values something, if God loves something and pours himself into something, then Satan's going to do everything he can to thwart that love of God in some way, that thing that God values, because God has a plan for the things that he values. So for Israel, he has a plan for Israel. And because he has a plan for Israel and the Jewish people that's connected to his big plan of redemption and how he's going to redeem the world, then guess what? Satan's going to do everything he can to thwart the Jewish people. It's the same thing with the church. Not only are the Jewish people some of the highest numbers when it comes to persecution around the world, Christians deal with a high number of persecution. We're talking about the Jewish people in New York, but what about the Samaritan's Purse in Central Park who are being persecuted for helping people, which is, just an oxymoron of all things, but they're being called bigoted and homophobic, and they're helping everybody, at no cost to them. So to me, it's really whatever God values, Satan's going to do everything he can to destroy it, because God has a plan for them. So this is not just a political or religious issue, as I think the world likes to look at it. This is a really deep spiritual issue. It's a thing that's happening behind the curtains that we can't see in the unseen. So, and it's all getting worked out in the way that anti-Semitism creeps up and bubbles up during these times.
Chris is with Friends of Israel, and just a reminder, listening friend, that if you'd like to get a year subscription to their magazine, a free subscription, Israel My Glory, you need to call them at 1-800-257-7843. You can mention you heard Chris on Crosstalk, you heard the special offer, and taking advantage of it, 1-800-257-7843. and call them during regular business hours, East Coast time. And if you can't get through today, try tomorrow or the next. But you can simply ask for Israel, My Glory. In light of all that's going on, I understand that there is a rabbi now out of Brooklyn, New York, Chaim Yaakov Frankel, but he's actually urging American Jews to leave for Israel, leave your homes, immigrate to Israel before a civil war breaks out. He says this: leave while it's possible. Things will get worse, and it will be difficult to move from one country to another. Any thoughts on this?
First let me say this, because I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit, is Israel's Independence Day. They just celebrated independence. This is the reason Israel was created. The state of Israel was created because, at some point governments do begin to break down. Governments, they have a way of shifting over time. And you know what? If a government becomes anti-Semitic in any way, they start to hate Jewish people, the Jewish people can't defend themselves in any way. This is the reason Israel was created, for the self-determination of the Jewish people. Now, I'm not saying that's happening here in the United States, but I think that rabbi is looking out and saying there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the world right now, especially in Europe, especially in the United States. There is a rise of anti-Semitism happening in the United States. And I think it's, Jewish people, he's saying, would do themselves a favor by going to the one place where you're guaranteed to be able to protect yourself. Now, again, I'm not trying to scare people at all. I don't think anti-Semitism is at a point where Jewish people are going to pack up and leave America. America's been so good to Jewish people over the years. It's been a safe haven for Jewish people. But also, as we talk about Israel's Independence Day in a little bit, this is the reason Israel was created. And I think the rabbi is looking at it from both a prophetic, messianic concept that, Jewish people are supposed to return to the homeland. And if you want to be able to defend yourself and not have to deal with constantly being the minority and constantly facing, persecution, then start packing your bags and going to Israel. We know this was happening in France. Jewish people in France that have lived in France for a very, very, very long time actually started moving over to Israel, buying apartments over there, and then going back to France to wait till it gets very bad, and then they're just going to pack up and move to Israel. There was a large number of European immigrants to Israel over the years because of anti-Semitism. So, again, not so much in America, but I can see where the rabbi is looking out and saying, things the way they're going, it might be good for American Jews to think this isn't the homeland. Maybe there's another place, and Israel is that place. But I think America's been good for a long time.
America has been good. What's sad is that America's been changing. We've seen some of the comments coming out of certain members of our U.S. Congress that are very, very disheartening in this regard. Chris, Independence Day for Israel, let's go 72 years ago. Wow, what an amazing event, a miraculous event, some would call the birth of the nation of Israel.
It's amazing to think where Israel is only after 72 years. It's a modern miracle. And they just, it's amazing how Israel structures its Independence Day. It's not just one day like we have July 4th. There's a series of events that take place. There's the Holocaust Remembrance that takes place this year in 2020. It was April 20th and 21st. So they remember the Holocaust and those who perished in the Holocaust and the need for a Jewish homeland. And then they have the Day of Remembrance that happened on April 27th and April 28th, where they remember those who fought in the War of Independence, in the Six-Day War, in the Yom Kippur War, and all throughout the protection of the 72 years of the State of Israel. Anyone who's lost their lives, they remember those people. And then following the Day of Remembrance, they go right into their Independence Day. They celebrate. So almost out of the ashes of the Holocaust, remembering those who had died to protect and to keep the freedoms and the determination of the Jewish people, right into this celebration of their independence. So I think it's a beautiful holiday, a beautiful celebration.
Chris Katalka, our guest here today. I'd like to open some phone lines here as well. I've got more questions I'd like to ask, but we want to give you opportunity to speak to our guest as well. Our number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. As we talk about Israel today, anti-Semitism, 800-733-9829. We'll be right back. James 4:14 poses this thought: For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. Have you ever stopped to consider where you will spend eternity? You may say, but I'm a good person. I care for my family. I feed the poor. I stand up for life and traditional values. While all of these things are good, they fall far short of God's standard. Every one of us has a sin issue that must be dealt with. Our sin separates us from God, and each of us deserves to be eternally removed from God in everlasting punishment. But out of God's great love, He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to bear our sins, shed His blood, die on the cross, and rise again. He is the only way of salvation, and it's imperative for you to place your trust in Him. If you're wrestling with this issue, we'd like to send you a complimentary leaflet, Where Will You Spend Eternity? To receive a copy, just ask for it when you call us at 1-800-729-9829. 800-729-9829. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Chris Katulka is with us today, host of the radio program, The Friends of Israel Today. And he is a speaker, writer, blogger for Friends of Israel, writes for Israel My Glory. By the way, if you'd like that magazine subscription at no cost, they give you 1 year by contacting them at 800-257-7843 or go to their website, FOI, standing for Friends of Israel, FOI.org. Chris, before we pick up our first call, we know there's been a whole lot of transition going on in Israel right now. We had multiple elections to determine prime minister, and we have the coalition forming between Benjamin Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, this coalition government. How is that working out at this point? Are there obstacles that they're facing in forming this? I see we still have the corruption charges that are weighing against the prime minister right now. How are things working out there?
Yeah, it's so difficult for Israel right now. I think most Israelis are very happy to have a unity government that's coming in. I know there's protests that are going on. I think that's normal, but I think most Israelis are just happy that after 18 months of trying to form a government, it's finally happening. But now these two men have to sit down, these two parties have to sit down and come to agreements on how they're going to do politics together, how they're going to roll out the next several months, if not years, of a unity government. And so it's very difficult right now. I heard that they had to go back to the drawing board on some areas on their agreements because the high courts didn't like some of the amendments that they had put into their agreement. And so they have to go back and rework a few things. But overall, I think it's going to be good for Israel to move forward. The one thing, though, sadly, I know a lot of our American friends love Benjamin Netanyahu, but I do think that this could be the last political leg of Netanyahu the next 18 months before he turns it over to Benny Gantz to be prime minister. So I think these are the last few months of Netanyahu. So I think he's going to try to do a lot to make his presence remembered and his legacy remembered in Israel.
Does that include annexation?
I think it includes annexation. And here's the thing, is Benny Gantz had to kind of give a head nod to that, and he did. A lot of people look at Benny Gantz and Netanyahu as two ends of the political spectrum, and they're really not. I mean, quite honestly, Benny Gantz is a much more moderate person than what the media likes to let on. So they agree on a lot of things. But I do think the West Bank annexation could happen, especially with President Trump's blessing, the Trump administration's blessing over the sovereignty of those areas of the land, which will be big. It will be very big, Jim, to see the West Bank, major portions of it, the Jordan Valley, annexed and turned over to Israel in full capacity.
Our lines are packed here. Let's go to them. Mark is calling from Monroe. You're on the air, Mark.
Yes, I'm of the opinion the United Nations, which happens to have its headquarters in New York City, is anti-Semitic. Do you think de Blasio is a tool for them as New York city mayor to oppress the Jewish community? And keep in mind, he was a bust as a presidential candidate, so I don't see where he has all that much U.S. popularity in any other capacity.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for that. So we got the UN, a home of the UN in New York City. They've been very anti-Semitic through the resolutions.
Yeah, you know what? I'd say they are very many of them of the countries are, if not most of them, I think he's right, are very anti-Zionist, and as a result can be very anti-Semitic, I think more than others. Having the Trump administration's UN ambassador in the UN, especially Nikki Haley, when she came in and said there's a new sheriff in town when it comes to Israel, I mean, she really shook the feathers in the UN. And I think the Trump administration continues to do that, to stand up for Israel. As to the relationship that it has to Bill de Blasio, I can't make that statement. I personally don't believe Bill de Blasio is an anti-Semite. I actually think he made a very poor misjudgment and mistake that he's going to regret for a very, very long time, because I actually think a lot of the Jewish community probably voted for him. So I think that he really probably backed himself into a corner, but I think he's right. I think the UN has a very big anti-Israel, anti-Jewish perspective, and you can see that played out in the different programs that they have and the different laws that come out of the UN.
Let's go to Boise, Idaho. Susie, thanks for calling Crosstalk. You're on the air.
Okay. Hi, everybody. And I just have a question about the people in Israel, if they are at all looking to Jesus. I don't see how they can be called God's glory or God's chosen people when they deny Christ. And I'm sure that you're aware that in the Bible there's a division between Judah and Israel went into captivity, the 10 tribes, and they never did go back to their homeland. So they were called Israel, and they never went back.
Okay, we're going to have our guest address that issue. Thank you, Susie. Chris?
Yeah, this is a great question. What happened to the 10 tribes of Israel? Actually, it's quite interesting. We've been dealing in the world, in the modern world today, with a refugee crisis. There's a problem in one area, and refugees move from one area to another area to escape conflict. Well, that's no different than what happened in the northern 10 tribes of Israel. The northern 10 tribes, a lot of them saw what was happening as the Assyrian king was coming down to take them away in 722 BC, and many fled for Judah. And that's actually the reason that King Hezekiah had to expand the walls of Jerusalem, was to incorporate those who had taken up residence in Jerusalem from the northern 10 tribes of Israel. So there are actually a lot of the tribes represented that moved down after 722 BC in order to escape the judgment that was coming. So that was one of the major reasons Hezekiah's wall was expanded out. And in fact, you can go to Jerusalem today and still see the remnants of Hezekiah's wall. But as for, Israel, the Jewish people, and God's judgment, look, I'm going to tell you something. Paul had a heart for his people. Jesus had a heart for his people. He loved his people. He came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Same thing with Paul. When Paul went to go minister to the Gentile nations as a missionary to the Gentiles, his first place to go was to his very own people. Even Paul says he would be willing to give up his very own salvation, that his own kinship, his brothers and sisters in his flesh, might actually come to know Jesus as the Messiah. So do I think God hates the Jewish people? No, never. In fact, I think God has been working for them to come to know the Lord Jesus. And I think you see that especially in Romans 9 through 11.
And I want to follow up another portion of Susie's question here. And I saw, another impact of COVID-19 is impacting Israel another way. And I saw a story recently about the gay pride parades in Tel Aviv, Beersheba, Haifa, Jerusalem, all postponed until the end of summer. They're hoping to still have them, according to the health ministry regulations. But many are shocked by the large gay pride events held in Israel every year. Some have questioned, how can Christians be in support of Israel with these things going on? And to Susie's question, if these people have denied Jesus, how can they be God's chosen people? Your response?
Yeah, I always like to go to Ezekiel chapter 37, too. There's this amazing moment where God brings these bones that are dusty, they are scattered. So, God has this vision that he brings Ezekiel into, and he goes, can these bones live? And, Ezekiel, being like most humans, goes, oh, God, only you know. Don't ask me that question. They look dead to me. Mm-hmm. And he encourages Ezekiel to prophesy over the bones, and the bones come back to life, and the bones stack, and they start to make people. And then it says sinew and muscles and flesh begin to form, and next thing you know, you've got an army standing before you, but it's just a dead-looking army. It's just a body. And you know what? Oftentimes I like to think of Israel in this moment where it's not quite finished yet. Because God actually takes a break there in Ezekiel chapter 37. He looks at the reformed body that was resurrected, that is the nation of Israel, as God says. And there's a pause there, and he goes, look at this. This is Israel, but it's still missing something. It's missing the breath of God. And so is God through with Israel? Paul says, may it never be. Mm-hmm. Is God working? Of course he's working. But is God done yet? No, he's not done yet. We're not there yet. We're not in the kingdom yet. God is still working. So what you see today, to me, is just what is eventually going to be in the future at the coming of our glorious Savior.
Thank you, Susie, for the call. Matter of fact,
great question.
And you find that word, everlasting covenants, an everlasting covenant. That doesn't have a point of cessation. John in Milwaukee, you're on the air.
Hi, I was listening to what Susie said, and I have an answer for what she's asking about the gay pride and that in Israel, is that people don't understand what the entire spectrum of Judaism is. Judaism ranges all the way from the Orthodox, which is very visible, all the way up to the secret Satanist on top. The Orthodox are just used as a distraction to distract the Goyim, to turn us into Golem to support Israel. Isn't that what Judaism means, the religion of Jewish supremacy?
Any thoughts, Chris?
Honestly, I do think you're right when it comes to different spectrums of Judaism in Israel. But, I don't know too much about what you're speaking of. But I will say that Israel is not a monolithic thought or religion. It doesn't have a monolithic thought or religion when it comes to Judaism. Most Jewish people in Israel are actually very secular. And by secular, they might believe in a God, but they don't believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then there's the Orthodox. Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are two different cities. They're only 40-some-odd miles apart, 50-some-odd miles apart, but they might as well be worlds apart because Jerusalem is very Orthodox, very religious, while Tel Aviv is very secular, very New York City-like. And so, there isn't just one spectrum of Israel. There is, just like in America, a multi-spectrum. It's a democracy. It's thriving. And it's a reconstituted state, I believe. But to speak to specifically what he was talking about, I'd have to say I don't know.
Thank you, John. Let's go to Lori in Michigan. You're on the air, Lori.
Yes, I wanted to say I had a friend that tried to convince me that we had replaced the Jews. But I told her, I said, I've read all through Scripture of how he keeps calling back and saying, I'm very angry with you and for your sin, but I am going to bring you back to the land, and I'm going to change your heart and take the heart of stone and turn it into a heart of flesh. And I said, for years I rebelled against God. And I said, if God would give up on the Jews, he would have given up on me too. And I said, so there's no way that I could ever believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would give up on his people, or he would have given up on me and I never would have gotten saved. So I felt like I need to tell my testimony, how I stood up for the Jews, and I know that Romans chapter 10 and Romans chapter 11, I believe it is very clear of how God brings his people back to himself, and you can't deny that. And I just want to thank the Lord that he had mercy on me, as he will have and is having on the Jewish people too.
Thank you, Lori, for sharing that. And Chris, I know this is one of the topics that have been addressed more than once in that magazine, Israel, My Glory.
That's right, and all I have to say is, Lori, keep preaching, sister, because that, to me, is exactly what Israel is. It's a testimony to God's faithfulness. Ezekiel chapter 36, God says to Israel, I'm not returning you to the land because of you, because you deserve it. I'm returning you to the land, and I have a promise that and a plan for you, because my holy name is connected to you. My holy reputation is connected to you. So it's not about Israel. It's actually about God's name that's at stake. And I just want to read this really quick, Jim, from Romans chapter 11, verse 28. As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies for your sake. But as far as election is concerned, speaking of the Jewish people, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. And so there's that whole idea, again, that God, yes, right now it looks one way, but that doesn't mean God's done with his people. His call and his gifts are irrevocable.
We've got to take a break here. We'll be back in 1 minute with Chris Katulka, our guest today from Friends of Israel. So, Paul, you hang on the line. You'll be our next caller here just right after the break. This is Crosstalk coming your way from VCY America. Our number 800-733-9829.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewradio.com. The globalists cannot let a good crisis go to waste. They also are committed to the long-term goals and objectives of their worldview. Remember the Club of Rome? Well, in 1972, they put out a book, 1972, called The Limits to Growth. It was based on an MIT model, and it was about population control. Well, guess what they did last year, 2019? They released a book called Planetary Emergency Plan. Wow. September 2019, they put out a book called Planetary Emergency Plan. Yep. And it was all about the green agenda and population control. And they talked about 2020 being the year of the super year, quote, super year of 2020, and that it would be 12 critical months for the people, nature, and climate. How did they know this? Many of these groups had their plans ready to go. That's why they're responding to the pandemic as they are.
This is Crosstalk on VCY America. Just a reminder, if you'd like to get that magazine, Israel My Glory, you may call them, request a free copy at 800, our free year subscription, 800-257-7843. Right now, going back to our lines here at Crosstalk, holding the longest has been Paul in Rochester, Minnesota. Paul, thanks for your patience. You're on the air.
Yes, I was just curious. What's Israel's relationship with China right offhand? I know that Israel used to allow warships to dock in Haifa, but now what's the status of their situation?
Okay, thank you.
This is a great question. You know, actually, Israel sits in the middle of everything. It sits in the middle of the continents of Europe. It sits in the middle of the continent of Africa, North Africa, and it sits in the middle of the continent of Asia. In fact, most people don't know this, but Israel is in the continent of Asia. It's in the Middle East, but it's in the continent of Asia. So recently, Netanyahu has been working hard to actually reach out, not just to the west where we are, but to the east of where they are, into China, into those Asian countries as well. And over the years has built a relationship with China. And yes, they have had a relationship, especially when it comes to the ports. I believe one of their ports was considering being sold to China, and I know the Trump administration was pushing for Israel not to allow that to happen in Israel. And there was one more thing as well, the new railroad line that opened up between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which is a huge, huge project that took many, many years, was actually a product that came out of China. Many Chinese builders came because the price was right. And so there was a relationship there, but I don't know how deep that relationship is now after the COVID-19 crisis, and I definitely don't know what it's like because I know they've been getting pressure from the Trump administration.
Thank you, Paul. Franco is next in Grand Marsh, Wisconsin. You're on the air.
Hi, good afternoon. I was just curious. When I was a youngster growing up in Milwaukee, on the news, I'd always hear about the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. I never hear nothing about them anymore. Could you just comment? What's going on with them? Are they still around? God bless.
Thank you.
Great question. And you know what? Honestly, the PLO still has a form of itself. It's kind of morphed in what's now called the Palestinian Authority, the PA, that is headed by a man named Mahmoud Abbas. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was founded by Yasser Arafat, that's a name that most people probably remember, still had its tentacles and still was working. In fact, the Trump administration closed down the PLO offices in the U.S. because they weren't advancing peace. So there was still that remnant of it. But the Palestinian administration has taken over the kind of the guardianship of the Palestinian people and the territories. The Palestinian Authority tried to have control over the Gaza Strip after 2006, 2007, when it was returned given to the Palestinians by Ariel Sharon and his government. But eventually the PA, the Palestinian Authority, was ruled out and kicked out for the most part by Hamas. So now you have Hamas in Gaza, you have the PA in the West Bank ruling the Palestinians. So two different governments ruling two different, the same people in two different areas of Israel, not far apart from one another. But it's still kind of the same administration in some way.
We're going next to Pennsylvania. We have Faith calling in. Hi, Faith. You're on the air.
Hi there.
Yes, I too had heard Rick Wiles, and something didn't, agree with what I knew. So I'm glad this was brought up about him, his anti-Semitism. I grew up in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and I knew of a Katalka. I think my brother went to school with a Katalka. But anyway, I just want you to know I appreciate the defenses that you people have made about the Jews, because I've been encountering some people that, are trying to be critical. And so thank you very much. I knew of Romans 9-11, and that was persuasive to me. But thank you for all the callers that have supported Israel, and for the magazine is excellent. I know that for sure.
Thank you, Faith.
Thank you, Chris.
Appreciate your call. Mike in Cookeville, Tennessee, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. I mistakenly got transferred over to you, but anyway, I was just interested in getting the Israel My Glory magazine for a full year, and I don't really have the number here to do that.
Okay, are you able to write it down as I give it to you?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's 1-800
Uh-huh.
257
Yes, sir.
7843.
All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Or you can go to foi.org. And what's interesting is some of these very questions that are coming up are articles that you'll find in there. We're going to squeeze one last call in, Vero Beach, Florida, and we have Jean calling in. Hi, Jean, you're on the air.
Hello, Jim, and I thank you for having this guest. Chris is great, and please have more shows like this on Israel. If we get our relationship with Israel, Jerusalem, and the Jews right, that pleases God. And my question is for Chris, that could he please elaborate on the notion that is commonly put forth about how Israel is taking land from the Palestinians or the other settlements, and really this is their land to begin with.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you, but we're down to 60 seconds. Chris, go ahead to use that 60 seconds.
This is a great question, Jim. You're going to have me back because it's a whole show, not 60 seconds, but 60 minutes to talk about this. But yes, it is Israeli land. Israelis have been buying up this land for a very long time. We have record of them buying the land all the way back to Genesis when Abraham bought the land as a burial place in Hebron for his family, all the way up to David buying land for the temple, all the way through today to when major Jewish donors and organizations were buying land legally in order for Jewish people to be a part of the land that God gave them. So not only did God give them the land, but they've been legally and responsibly buying the land back in many ways, which is just a funny thing to think about. But they've been on the up and up. It's their land, and not only according to what God said, which is the most important, but also to what international law says as well.
So thank you for the call. Matter of fact, the Friends of Israel has put out a book called Whose Land Is It Anyway? Israel, Whose Land Is It Anyway? And you also have information on your website pertaining to it.
That's right.
Great.
FOI.org.
FOI.org. Or you may call them at 800-257-7843. Chris, thank you for being with us and giving us such valuable information that we could share with our listeners today.
That's fantastic. Glad to be with you, Jim.
Okay, Chris Contalco from Friends of Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from CrosstalkAmerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.
With SRN News, I'm John Scott. Before he left for Arizona, President Trump says Americans want to get back to work with measures to protect against a new surge of the coronavirus.
Our country wants to open, and you see what's going on. They have to open. And the people of our country should think of themselves as warriors. Our country has to open. Those projections are with no mitigation.
The president will be in Phoenix later, touring a plant that manufactures the